The morning of the orchard auction. There were 41 apple trees nobody wanted. They stood roped off in the back corner of the Hollies County equipment yard. The corner the auctioneer called salvage lots and everyone else called firewood. And they had the look of things that had already lost the argument with time. Their bark had gone gray and cracked in long fissures. Their limbs hung crooked. Some split clean through and held together by nothing but stubbornness and old sap. A canker had gotten into half of them the summer before. And the county extension office had already written a report recommending the whole block be pulled and burned. They had come off the old Renner place. A 100-acre orchard that had gone under when the bank finally lost patience with 3 bad years running. And by the time anyone got around to selling off the last of it, there was nothing left in that corner but the trees too far gone for a real buyer to want. And into that corner in a cold morning in early March walked an old man not far from 70, with a bidding paddle in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, and no particular expression on his weathered face. His name was Warren Aldis, and he had farmed 40 miles from that yard his entire life. Though not one soul in that crowd could have told you what he grew or how he made a living at it. Because Warren Aldis had never been a man who explained himself. He stood at the rope for a long time without saying a word. Long enough that the men near him started to notice. Long enough that the auctioneer cleared his throat twice waiting on somebody to move. And then Warren raised his paddle and bought all 41 trees for less than the price of a good used chainsaw. Somebody laughed. It was Dale Kessner, who ran the biggest commercial orchard operation in 3 counties and had never once in his life let an opportunity to comment pass him by. He looked at the trees and he looked at Warren and he said, loud enough to carry across the yard, that the old man had just paid good money for a pile of kindling. And that whatever he thought he was going to do with wood that far gone, he'd be cutting it up for the stove by Thanksgiving. He meant it as a joke at another man's expense. It would turn out to be a description of something else entirely. If this is the kind of story that pulls you in, the slow kind, where the thing everybody wrote off turns out to be the thing worth having all along, do me a favor before we keep going. Hit the like button so more people see this. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because I read every one of them and I like knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. Warren Aldis had not gone to that auction because he needed trees. He went because of a promise he'd made 40 years earlier to a man who was no longer alive to collect on it. And because a phone call 3 weeks prior had told him the Renner orchard was finally being broken up for parts. And something in him had refused to let that particular corner of it go to a bonfire. To understand why, you have to go back to when Warren was 26 years old, freshly discharged from the service, restless in a way he didn't have words for, and working odd jobs around the county trying to figure out what a life was supposed to look like. He'd taken on seasonal labor at the old Renner orchard the autumn he came home, mostly because it paid in cash and asked no questions. And it was there he met a man named Otto Brantz, the orchard's foreman, a stooped German immigrant in his 60s, who had been grafting and pruning apple wood since before Warren's own father was born. Otto did not talk much, and what he did say said in a low, unhurried voice that made you lean in to catch it. He had a habit of running his thumb along a branch before he cut it, feeling for something Warren couldn't name, and he would stand in front of a tree for 5 minutes before he ever raised his shears. The way another man might stand in front of a puzzle he intended to solve properly or not touch at all. Warren, 26 and hungry to be taught something, followed him around that orchard for 2 full seasons. And Otto let him follow, though he corrected him constantly and praised him almost never. It was Otto who first said the line that would follow Warren the rest of his life. They were standing in front of a row of old, gnarled trees near the back fence one October afternoon, trees that were even then 40 years old and twisted with age. The kind of trees a younger orchardist would have already ripped out and replaced with tidy new stock that fruited faster and looked better on a spreadsheet. Otto put his hand flat against the trunk of the oldest one in the row and said that the wood remembers. He said that a young tree on good soil with plenty of water will grow fast and look fine and taste like nothing at all. But a tree that has survived 40 winters, that has been cut back hard and healed itself over and over, that has learned the shape of every frost and drought that ever tried to kill it, that tree has character in the wood. And character in the wood is what makes fruit worth eating instead of just fruit worth selling. He said any fool could grow an apple. Almost nobody had the patience to grow a good one. Warren had written the phrase down on the back of a feed receipt that night. Not because he understood it, but because it felt like something he wanted to understand eventually. He kept that scrap of paper in a coffee can in his barn for the next 40 years. Otto died the winter Warren turned 28. Of a heart that simply stopped one morning in the cold storage shed. And the Renner family, grieving and unsentimental about orchard work, hired a younger foreman who ripped out the old back rows within 2 seasons because they didn't produce enough tonnage to justify the ground they stood on. Warren had moved on by then to his own small piece of land. A hardscrabble 40 acres his own father had left him. Rocky and steep and generally agreed by the neighbors to be unfit for much beyond running a few goats. He never forgot Otto and he never forgot the phrase. But he had no orchard of his own to put it to use in. And for 4 decades the idea simply sat in him unused. The way a tool sits in a drawer waiting for a job that never quite arrives. Then at 69 years old, widowed 2 years and with his own children long grown and settled far from that county, Warren got the phone call that the Renner place was finally being broken up. And that among the salvage lots going to auction was the last surviving stretch of the old back fence rows, the very trees Otto Brandt had once stood in front of with his hand flat against the bark, saying that the wood remembers. Everyone assumed those trees were long gone. It turned out a later owner had simply neglected that corner instead of clearing it. Too disorganized to even properly abandon it. And 41 of the old trees had survived, untended and canker-scarred into the present day. Warren did not think about it for very long. He drove to the auction with his thermos of coffee. And he bought them and he became in that instant the second man in Hollis County ever to believe that those particular trees were worth more than the price of the wood they'd make when burned. The first thing Warren did before he pruned a single limb was go looking for what remained of Otto Brandt in the world. Otto had no children in this country and no grave anyone local could point to. He'd been shipped back to relatives overseas after his death. As best anyone remembered, but Otto had a niece. Or a woman the town simply called his niece, though the exact relation had blurred over 60 years of retelling. And her name was Ilse Prout. And she was 91 years old and lived alone above the old hardware store in town, having outlived 2 husbands and most of her own generation. Ilse was not by any account an easy woman to sit with. She kept a house so silent you could hear the refrigerator hum from the next room. And she answered questions with exactly as many words as the question required, and not one more. But she had spent her girlhood summers trailing after her uncle through the Renner orchard rows, the way children do when there's a beloved adult and nothing better to occupy an afternoon. And she remembered things. Warren went to see her the week after the auction. And he brought with him the one physical thing he had of Otto's, the feed receipt from 40 years earlier with the 6 words written on the back in his own young hand. The wood remembers. Otto said so. He set it on her kitchen table and asked her plainly what her uncle had meant by it. Because he had bought 41 trees on the strength of a phrase he'd never fully understood. And he intended to understand it now before he did something foolish to them. Ilse looked at the paper for a long while. Then she said that her uncle had spent 30 years in this country trying to convince orchard owners of a thing that cost them money to believe. Which was that an old tree, cut back hard and nursed slowly instead of ripped out and replaced, would eventually outproduce and outlast anything you planted new, not in tonnage. Never in tonnage, but in the thing that mattered more than tonnage, which was flavor and character, and the kind of fruit that made a person who tasted it stop talking for a second. Young wood said, grows fast because it hasn't had to survive anything yet. Old wood that has survived hard things develops something in the fruit that you cannot rush and cannot buy and cannot fake with fertilizer, no matter how much money you throw at the ground. She told him that most of the growers in this county, her uncle included at the very start of his career, wanted trees that behaved even output predictable size. No trouble but the trees worth having. The trees that made an orchard's name instead of just its income were nearly always the twisted scarred, unreasonable-looking ones that had been rescued rather than raised. Her uncle used to say that the salvage rows were where the truth was, because that's where you found the wood that had already proven the hard way that it wanted to live. Then she said, almost as an afterthought, that if Warren was thinking of doing what she suspected he was thinking of doing, he should go slow cut less than he wanted to the first year, and watch which limbs pushed new growth in the spring before he decided what to save and what to let go. Those are the ones worth keeping, she said. The ones that still push after everything. That was the whole of her advice. It turned out to be enough. So Warren went home to his 41 salvage trees, standing crooked and canker-marked in the back corner of his own rocky ground, where he had cleared a half acre the previous fall without entirely knowing why. And he began the slowest, least glamorous work of his life. He did not prune hard that first spring, though every instinct in him and every neighbor who drove by and squinted at the rows told him he ought to cut the whole mess back to nothing and start over. Instead, he waited the way Ilse had told him to. Through April and into May, watching each tree. Marking in a small notebook, he had started keeping one almost without deciding to. The way people do when they've begun to take something seriously, which limbs were pushing new leaf growth and which had gone quietly, permanently dead over the winters. He cut only the dead wood that first year, nothing else. He learned to read canker the way Otto must have read it once, cutting back to clean wood on the diseased limbs, sealing the wounds, and then leaving the tree alone to do the rest of the healing itself, resisting the urge to intervene further. It was work that produced almost nothing visible for months at a time. The kind of labor that is invisible to anyone who isn't paying close attention. Which meant it was invisible to nearly everyone in Hollis County. Dale Kessner, whose commercial orchard ran nearly 800 trees on flat, zero-gated, chemically managed ground 2 miles down the road, drove past Warren's rocky half-acre often enough on his way to the feed co-op. And he made a small local habit of it. The way Warren's neighbors made a habit of most things that amused them cheaply. At the co-op counter, in front of the same handful of men who gathered there most mornings to trade prices and complaints, Dale would ask with a grin that never quite reached his eyes, whether Warren's kindling had started fruiting yet, or whether he'd gotten around to that bonfire he was owed. Warren bought what he came for and answered plainly and did not rise to it. Once, when a younger man named Eddie Voss asked him outright whether he was going to just let the whole lot die slow instead of quick, Warren said, "Working on it," in a tone so level it took the fun clean out of the question. And Eddie didn't quite know what to say after that. The man who ran the co-op counters, an old-timer named Perry Nash who had known 3 generations of both Aldises and Renners, watched these exchanges without comment. But he caught Warren once on his way out and said, almost to himself, that Otto Brandt used to buy that same kind of stock, canker-scarred, half-dead salvage nobody else wanted, and that people had laughed at him too, for years before they stopped. Then he rang Warren up and said nothing further. But Warren wrote it down that night, because he was learning to trust the small confirmations. And because it was the first time in 40 years anyone had said Otto's name to him as though it still meant something. By that first autumn, the healing wood on Warren's trees had begun slowly to show. Not a great deal, no crop to speak of yet, and nothing anyone driving by would call impressive, but the canker had stopped spreading on the trees he'd cut back carefully, and new growth had come in green and vigorous along the limbs he'd chosen to keep. Exactly the way Ilse had told him it would if the wood truly wanted to live. He thinned nothing further and fed the ground beneath the rows with nothing but composted leaves and the manure from his own small flock of sheep. The same slow, patient, unhurried care Otto had once practiced on trees now 60 years gone. Winter came down hard that year in Hollis County. A stretch in January when the temperature didn't climb above 10 degrees for the better part of 2 weeks. The kind of cold that kills weak wood outright and separates, brutally and without appeals, the trees that HVE Chinese letter THE reserves to survive from the trees that don't. It was the season the county quietly expected to finish off what the canker hadn't. Because everyone knew that trees already stressed and scarred going into a hard winter were trees that generally didn't come out the other side. Dale Kessner said as much at the co-op more than once, that the old man's little experiment would be settled by the spring thaw one way or another. And there'd be 41 dead stumps to show for it. But Warren had listened to Ilse. And Ilse had learned from a man who spent his life proving that survivors survive, because something in them already knows how. And Warren wrapped the graft unions in burlap against the worst of the cold, mulched the root zones heavy with straw, and did nothing else but wait and watch. The way you wait and watch over anything whose fate is mostly out of your hands. They came through, all 41 of them. When the thaw finally broke in March, showed live buds swelling along the branches Warren had chosen to save. Not one had died over that brutal stretch of cold. And when the blossoms came in April, sparse that first real, white and fragrant across the crooked old limbs, Warren stood at the fence of his half-acre in the low morning light and wrote in his notebook, without ceremony, the daytime beneath it. 4 words, 41 trees all living, the second summer. The trees set fruit for the first time since Warren had bought them, not much. A modest scattering of apples across those 41 gnarled old trees. Nothing that would ever show up as a meaningful line item on anybody's ledger. But when Warren picked the first ripe apples that September and cut into one on his own kitchen counter, He understood chewing. Exactly what Otto Brandt had meant all those decades earlier. It did not taste like anything from a grocery store bin. It was dense and complex in a way young orchard fruit never manages. Sharp and sweet and faintly smoky all at once. The flavor of a tree that had survived 40 years of frost and neglect and disease, and had turned every one of those hardships into something concentrated in the fruit itself. Warren sat at his kitchen table a long while with the core in his hand. And then he wrote one word in his notebook and underlined it the way he imagined. Otto might have underlined a thing that mattered. The word was proven he did not advertise it. Warren was not built for advertising any more than he was built for arguing with a man like Dale Kessner. But he mentioned it in the flats. Unhurried way he mentioned most things. To Perry Nash at the co-op counter. That he had more apples put up than he and his family could eat. And would Perry care for a bushel, Perry took the bushel. Tasted one that evening. And drove out to Warren's place himself the following week, something almost nobody in that county bothered to do, and walked the rows with him in the low autumn light. Near the back fence, Perry stopped in front of the very trees Otto Brandt himself had once stood before. And he crouched down unprompted, and pressed his thumb into the bark the way old orchard men do when they're checking for something they can't quite name. He straightened up slowly and said that in 50 years of watching this county farm itself thin, he hadn't tasted an apple like that since Otto Brandt quit selling them to the little grocer on 3rd Street. Back before Warren was even out of the service. He said his late wife would have loved it. And he asked whether Warren minded if he told a few people where he'd gotten it. Warren said he did not mind, he said it plainly. Not understanding yet that in granting that one small permission, he had set the whole thing in motion. Because Perry Nash told people the way a good storekeeper tells things, not with any announcement, but dropped quietly into the right conversation at the right moment. Mentioning to a customer who complained that apples didn't taste like they used to that there was an old man out on Miller Road, growing them the old way. Off trees nobody else had wanted. And that it was worth the drive if you cared about the difference. And those people told other people. The way the story of the kindling trees had traveled the county 2 years before. Only now the story had turned itself inside out. And the thing everyone had laughed at had quietly become the thing people were curious about. By the 3rd autumn, Warren had a short list of names in the back of his notebook, people who'd bought a bushel and wanted another. A woman from the church who ran a bed and breakfast 2 towns over who wanted to stand in line for whatever he had left. A cider maker from the county seat who drove out unannounced one Saturday having heard a rumor and left 3 hours later with an order Warren couldn't fully fill. He raised his prices modestly, nobody balked. He wrote the total in his notebook, looked at the number for a moment, then closed the book and went out to check the sheep. Because the work didn't stop just because the numbers had started to look good. It was that same autumn that Dale Kessner drove out to Warren's place for the first time. Though he did not come to apologize. Because men like Dale do not come to apologize. They come to appraise. To settle for themselves in person a thing that has started to nag at them from a distance. He arrived in his big truck on a cool October afternoon and sat in the cab a while before getting out. Looking at the crooked old rows heavy with fruit that, by every rule Dale had ever farmed by, shouldn't have been producing anything worth eating at all. He got out eventually, walked the rows with his hands in his pockets, and picked an apple without asking and bit into it standing right there in the grass. He chewed for a long moment, then he said, in a tone stripped clean of the mockery Warren had come to expect from him, that it was good. That was all he said at first, it's good, which from Dale Kessner was an admission of a size Warren understood completely. Warren kept walking and said thank you and asked if he wanted to see the rest. And Dale said he did. They walked the whole half-acre together. And Dale ran his hand along the scarred old bark the way Perry had. And was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he'd been running his own 800 trees for going on 30 years. Pouring more fertilizer and more spray and more irrigation into them every season just to keep his yields where the bank expected them. And that his fruit tasted, if he was honest, like less than it used to, no matter what he put into the ground, and that he'd driven out here fully expecting to find 41 dead sticks. And instead he was standing in front of the best apple he'd eaten in a decade. Grown on trees he himself had told this man to burn. He did not say it as praise. He said it the way a man says a thing that has quietly upended the rules he built his whole life on. Warren, who understood something about the disorientation of ground shifting under a person, did not press the moment. He only said that most of the credit belonged to a foreman named Otto Brandt, who died 40 years ago and never got to see any of it. and that he just tried to do right by what the old man had taught him. Dale looked at him a while, then asked if Warren would show him the notebook. Warren did. Dale never told a soul at the co-op that he'd been wrong outright, men like Dale rarely do, but he stopped asking about the kindling. And Eddie Voss kept the joke alive on his own for a few more months out of pure momentum, before he noticed nobody was laughing at it with him anymore. And the following spring, Dale came back with a proposal. He'd fence off the worst quarter-acre of his own operation. The rocky, half-shaded strip near the property line that had never produced well no matter what he fed it. And he wanted to try the old man's slow method on it, hard cutback the first year. Patient healing, no chemical push. Just time and attention, and he wanted Warren to come look at it every month and tell him what he was doing wrong. Warren thought about it for a week, then said yes. Because he'd come by then to understand something in his own life that mattered more to him than any fruit he could grow. Which was that a thing you keep entirely to yourself dies with you. And a thing you teach outlives you. He decided he'd rather be the second kind of man. Word of Dale Kessner's quiet conversion did more for Warren's little half-acre than any success of his own could have managed alone. Because Dale wasn't his way. The loudest and most established voice in that whole part of the county. And when he began quietly, without ever quite admitting it in so many words, farming a corner of his own land the way the old man on Miller Road did, the entire scale of what people believed was possible shifted with him. Other growers started driving out. Mostly older men who had spent their whole working lives pushing their ground harder every year, and had a bad feeling in their bones about where that road eventually led. Warren walked them through his rows and let them press their thumbs into the bark the way Perry had. And let them taste an apple straight off the tree. And he never once charged anyone for the walking. Though a fair number of them went home and started nursing their own worst. Most written off corners back to life instead of clearing them. One of those men was a young fellow named Curtis Boyd, who had inherited the poorest ground in the township, along with a debt his father had left him. And who reminded Warren's, in some way he couldn't quite articulate, of himself at 26. Following Otto Brandt around an orchard hungry to be taught something. Warren spent an entire spring showing Curtis how to read a scarred old tree. How to tell healable canker from wood that was truly finished. How to wait instead of cut. By the following autumn, Curtis could nearly read a row of trees as well as Warren could himself. And Warren watched him crouch down at the base of an old apple tree one afternoon. Thumb pressed into the bark exactly the way Perry Nash had once done it. Exactly the way Warren imagined. Though he'd never seen it himself, Otto Brandt must have done it 60 years before either of them were born. And he understood in that instant the full shape of what Otto had really meant about the wood remembering. It wasn't only the tree that remembered. It was the knowledge itself, passing hand to hand through people. From a dead man through a scrap of paper in a coffee can. Through an old woman's kitchen table into Warren's hands. And now into a young man who would carry it forward into a life Warren himself would never see the end of. But the thing that turned Warren's quiet little success into something the whole region eventually talked about was the late frost. It came in the 5th spring. The year the whole county's orchards bloomed 2 weeks early after an unusually warm March. Only for an Arctic front to drop out of Canada in the 2nd week of April and put every blossom in the region at risk in a single brutal night. It was the kind of frost that orchard men fear more than any drought or hailstorm. Because a tree that loses its blossoms in one bad night loses its entire year's crop in the same instant. No matter how healthy the wood beneath the bark. The commercial orchards Dale Kessner's flat, tidy rows among them, ran every wind machine and smudge pot they owned that night, and still lost the better part of their bloom to the cold. Because young fast-grown, heavily irrigated wood carries its sap close to the surface, and has almost no capacity to buffer a hard freeze on its own. Warren's 41 old trees, and the quarter-acre Dale had been nursing the slow way for 2 seasons, came through that same night largely untouched. Not because Warren did anything special, he ran no wind machines, lit no smudge pots, owned no equipment that could have helped even if he'd wanted to use it, but because old, hard-cut wood carries its sap deeper and blooms with a natural staggering that spreads the risk across weeks, instead of concentrating it all in one vulnerable week. A fact Otto Brandt had apparently understood 60 years earlier, and had simply never gotten the chance to prove its scale before the back rows were torn out from under him. The county turned up that April to a landscape where the newest, best attended, most heavily invested orchards had lost their year almost entirely. While a rocky half-acre of trees, everyone had once agreed were fit only for a bonfire, stood in full, undamaged bloom, people drove out just to look at it. The way you drive out to look at a thing that shouldn't make sense and does anyway. Warren's yield that year modest as his Operation Wasp became. In relative terms, one of the only full crops in the whole township. And the cider maker who'd been buying from him for 2 seasons now put in an order larger than Warren had fruit to fill. Dale Kessner stood at Warren's fence one gray April afternoon, looking out at blossoms that had survived a night his own 800 trees mostly hadn't, and said plainly that Warren had been right, and that he himself had been wrong, and that a man named Otto Brandt neither of them had ever properly met had been right about all of it 40 years before either of them understood a single word of it. Warren stood beside him a while without answering. Then he said only that Otto used to say the wood remembers, and that he guessed the wood had remembered a good deal longer than anyone in that county had given it credit for. He didn't say he'd been right, he didn't have to. The blossom said it for him all the way down the row. That autumn, with demand for Warren's fruit and Warren's knowledge outpacing anything a rocky half-acre could supply, was the moment as these stories go, where a different kind of man might have made a different kind of mistake. He could have borrowed against the sudden attention, bought more ground, planted faster, scaled the whole operation up the way Dale Kessner once had and had lately come to regret. Buyers and lenders both would have lined up for it. But Warren had spent 5 years now living by the same unhurried patience Otto Brandt had practiced his entire life. And he understood finally and completely that the deepest part of what Otto had taught him was never really about apples at all. It was about refusing to grow faster than the ground could honestly support, adding a row only when the last row had proven itself, taking on debt to nobody, letting demand pull the little orchard forward instead of pushing it forward with borrowed money, so that when the hard years inevitably came again, as they always do, Warren would owe nothing to anyone and could weather them on nothing but the strength of the ground itself. So he grew the way Otto would have grown. He added a second small block the following spring, salvaged again from another failing orchard 2 counties over, bought outright with cash he'd earned rather than credit he'd borrowed. And he rested and nursed those trees the same slow way for 2 full years before he sold a single apple off them. He taught Curtis Boyd everything he knew and helped him do the same on his own poor ground, quietly without ever calling it charity. And when a small regional food magazine eventually got wind of the old man on Miller Road and his 41 rescued trees, and ran a short piece calling the fruit some of the finest heirloom cider apples left in the state, Warren read it once, said nothing about it to anyone at the co-op, and went back out to check on the sheep, because the work never stopped simply because the world had finally noticed it. Ilse Prout lived long enough to see all of it. She was 96 the spring of the late frost, and Warren drove her out to the orchard himself one clear morning in May. The old woman sitting straight-backed in the truck the whole way, saying little because she never had said much. They stood together at the back fence in the early light and looked out over the blooming rows. And Curtis moved among the trees in the distance the way he'd been taught, checking each trunk with his thumb the way generations before him had. Ilse did not say much because she never had, but she reached out and laid her hand on the top rail of the fence, the same fence line, more or less, where her uncle had once stood with his own hand flat against the bark of a tree neither of them had lived to see saved. And after a long while she said that her uncle would have liked to see this, and that he'd known near the end of his life, that he wasn't really worried about the knowledge dying with him, because the wood would keep it, and someday the right person would come along and read what the wood had to say. Warren said he supposed he'd turned out to be the one who came back for it. Ilse looked at him, and something moved across her face that might, in another woman, have been called a smile. "Those are the ones," she said, which was very nearly what she had told him at her kitchen table 5 years before. Except Warren understood now that she meant something larger by it that she'd known that very first afternoon. Exactly what she was looking at when an old man laid a 40-year-old feed receipt on her table and asked her to explain 6 words written on the back of it. She died the following winter quietly in her sleep, in the small apartment above the hardware store where she'd lived for decades. Warren attended the small service in town and afterward drove out to his orchard alone in the fading light and stood at the fence for a long while, the way he had that very first morning at the auction, looking at rows of trees that had once been 41 pieces of firewood nobody wanted and were now the reason people drove 2 hours from the city just to taste something real. He felt the particular ache that comes with any triumph that arrives too late for the people who would have been proudest of it. Otto, dead 40 years before any of this bore fruit. And now Ilse too, gone before she could see quite how far it had traveled beyond that one May morning at the fence. But he understood standing there that this was simply the shape triumph and grief always take when they arrive bound together, and that there was nothing to be done about it except keep the ground the way it deserved to be kept. That spring he named a young graft, taken from the oldest and best of the original 41 trees. After Ilseend planted it at the near end of the second block, where he could see it from the porch. He wrote her name in his notebook beside the date. Without ceremony the way he wrote everything. And beneath it for the first time, he wrote a line that wasn't a weather note or a record of the harvest. It was a line of his own, one he'd been circling for 5 years without quite letting himself say it outright. He wrote "The wood remembers," and he underlined it once, the way he imagined Otto Brandt might have underlined the things that mattered most. So that someday, whoever eventually walked these same rows after him, Curtis, most likely, or somebody not yet born, would open this same notebook the way Warren had once opened a feed receipt from a coffee can, and find the phrase waiting for them handed down still true. The morning he made that entry his own count, there were just over 300 trees standing across his 2 small blocks, descended, in the truest sense that mattered, from 41 canker-scarred, half-dead salvage trees that an entire county had once agreed weren't worth the cost of hauling away. Warren stood at the fence in the early light and looked out at them for a long while without saying anything. Longer than seemed reasonable. The same way he'd looked at them that first cold morning in the salvage corner of the equipment yard. And this time nobody left. Because there was nobody left in that county who didn't understand. Finally and completely, the thing he had seen all along when he first raised his paddle for a pile of trees, everyone else had already given up on, that the rejected thing is very often the valuable thing, if you're patient enough to learn how to read it. That the trees which have already survived something carry more in them than the trees that never had to. That worth doesn't need to argue on its own behalf. Because sooner or later, if you give it enough time and enough care, it simply proves itself.